Hello, this is Tim. I want to show you a couple of tricks that I use when I assemble my shocks. When I install my seals, I like to use the associated green slime. I put a liberal coating on each O-ring as I install them in the shock. In this way the shocks will run smoother and the seals will last longer. On this type of shock you can use a small flat blade screwdriver to install the retaining clip. Always check to make sure the retaining clip is seated properly in the shock. Before installing the pistons, check for any burrs or flashing on the edges or in the holes of the piston, and then remove them carefully with a sharp X-Acto knife, making sure that you don't alter the shape of the piston or the holes. If your piston is held on with a nut, be careful not to over-tighten it, causing the piston to distort and rub on the side of the shock body. Now here's a trick I came up with that allows you to hold on to the shock shaft without having to use a pair of pliers. I fold a piece of duct tape over the shock shaft and apply it on both sides of my finger. I then spin the shock shaft in the direction that I'll be tightening the nut. I only tighten the nut enough to prevent the shock piston from spinning. After removing the duct tape, I then use alcohol to remove any sticky film left behind by the tape. Before installing the shock shaft into the shock body, I apply green slime to the threads. This helps prevent tearing the O-rings while installing the shock shaft. Before installing the plastic eyelet onto the end of the shock shaft, I wipe off the excess grease. I then take a piece of duct tape, fold it over the shock shaft and apply it to each side of my index finger. I then spin the shock shaft in the direction I'll be screwing the plastic eyelet in. This method really works great and you'll never damage a shock shaft using it. You can see here that I'm applying a lot of force to the shock shaft and it doesn't slip once. After removing the tape, I use the tape to remove any residue glue. I then use alcohol to remove the rest. When installing the shock bladder into the shock cap, I carefully use a small flat blade screwdriver to set it into position. I then use the shock body to seat it all the way down. When filling the shock body with shock oil, I fill it about halfway. I then move the piston up and down to eliminate any air bubbles behind the shock piston. I will then set the shock into a shock stand for several minutes, allowing the bubbles in the oil to surface. When all the bubbles are gone, I then fill the rest of the shock with oil. On most 8th scale off-road shocks, I fill up to about 1/8 of an inch to the rim. I then push the shock shaft roughly halfway up before installing the cap. While installing the cap, I hold the shock at about a 45-degree angle, with the hole in the cap facing up. The hole allows the excess air inside the shock to escape. You know you've done this correctly when you see little bubbles and then finally clean oil coming out the hole. Be careful not to over-tighten the shock cap, because you can tear or displace the shock bladder from its position. For most off-road shocks, you'll find that the shock shaft will come back out about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch after pushing it all the way in. Here's a trick I use for getting the shock boot over the shock eyelet without tearing. First I apply just a little tiny lube on the end of the shock eyelet. And then while holding onto the shock shaft, I slide the shock boot over the shock eyelet. This makes it surprisingly easy. You want to be careful not to tear the shock boot when putting the shock retaining cup on. Pull the spring back so you can put the cup on about the midpoint of the shock shaft. I then make sure I have about a 1/8 overlap of the shock boot onto the shock eyelet. I then carefully place the shock cap down onto the shock eyelet. I hope these tips were helpful, and thank you for visiting Nitro House.